Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 6. I enjoy this one especially because we start to get into some of the fun stuff. Not that the stuff that we've been covering isn't fun, it's becoming a little bit more real world. And we can really apply these concepts and just talk about some really fun things. But what we're first going to do is we're going to take a bigger, broader look at the classifications of joints, like what type of joints your body is made up of. And then we're actually going to dive into some fun things like mobility versus stability. And this can provoke some interesting discussions. So I believe that that's going to be our next discussion in our discussion board, which you should see later. All right, so let's just go ahead and dive in. So first of all, we have something called a fibrous joint. If you remember me mentioning the sacroiliac joint or the sutures in the skull, I mentioned that, there's not much movement and they're connected by a very, very taut structure, a very taut connective tissue. So what it is you have two bones that are united by this fibrous connective tissue, which makes sense, right? Fibrous joint, fibrous connective tissue. There's no joint cavity. So what does that mean? That means that there's no kind of hollow space where synovial fluid is going to be in, as well as lubricating the joint and so much more. Okay, so there's no little bubble space in there. Right here it says exhibits little to no movement. Depends on who you talk to. Say SI joints, do they move, do they not? Coronal sutures, do they move, do they not? But in the textbook definition, it is little to no movement. In my personal experience, there is a little bit of movement. Cartilaginous joints. This means that it's joined by, guess what? Cartilage. Two bones joined together by either hyaline or fibrocartilage. Again, no joint cavity. And these guys exhibit little to no movement. Again, in my profession, I see these guys move quite a bit, especially since I specialize in women's health. The pubic symphysis right on the front of your pelvis, you guys should remember that from your diagrams. That guy can move significantly if we have birth trauma or birth in general, just due to the way that the pelvis moves as baby exits. So like I say, cartilaginous joint, guess what? There's cartilage that is joining those two bones, little to no movement depending on the situation. And then we have a synovial joint. Guess what this has? This has a synovial fluid or synovial space. We have that joint cavity. And this joint cavity is surrounded by beautiful capsular ligaments that help to create this beautiful space. It's filled with synovial fluid for lubrication, meaning that think about your shoulder joints and your hip sockets. You can have this beautiful range of motion, and as long as those ligaments are providing that almost that stability in that space, you have a lot of space for that synovial fluid to be able to lubricate and make that motion smooth. Some possess cartilaginous discs. Some possess some intra or extra-auricular ligaments, and you usually have a big range of movement, which makes sense, right? Think about your shoulder joint. You got a lot of movement there. Now, we had these three: fibrous, cartilaginous, and then synovial joint like classifications, right? Well, now we're going to break down synovial joints into a few subtypes, okay? First one is uniaxial. Think about your elbow joint where you bend and straighten your arm. It has a joint in which a motion occurs around one axis, similar to a hinge joint. So think about a hinge joint. This is kind of, think about opening and closing a bedroom door. You have a convex cylinder in one bone, and then you have a concavity on the other bone, and those are articulating around each other. Great example is your elbow, just like what I was saying. It's just that hinge, beautiful open and close, not much other movement happening within that space. Then you have a uniaxial. This has to do with the radial ulnar, so it's still in your elbow, it's just that littler bone on the outside. This joint actually has a motion that occurs in around one axis and one plane, okay? So think about a pivot joint. Pivot joints consist of a cylindrical bony process that rotates within a ring of a bone, cartilage, or ligament. So think about your radial head right here. See how it's kind of a cylinder that's circled? Well, it rotates over and around your ulna. How awesome is that? So for you to supinate and pronate, at the elbow, there's actually the radius rotating around the humerus and then rotating back. And if you remember me talking about C1, C2 vertebra in the head and neck, remember how I talked about how the dens on C2 on axis creates this unique structure where C1 can rotate around the dens of C2? That is what a pivot joint is. It's pivoting around a structure or being able to pivot around a structure. Biaxial, so again, this is a subset of synovial joints. Biaxial, it makes sense that we're actually going to have two planes, two axes. Condyloid, now these guys are interesting because the MCP joint in basically the base of the skull, the anterooccipital joint, that's where C1 articulates with the base of the skull, means that there's two ipsilateral surfaces, one concave, one convex, okay? That's basically a fancy way of saying you're able to move in multiple different ranges. Think about how you're able to move your head and neck. Your neck or your head can bob and weave. That's what we're similarly talking about. We'll break this down more in later PowerPoints and stuff like that. But just for now, get familiar with these terms. Now, this one kind of throws people for a loop, so I'll try to talk you through this. This next biaxial is called a saddle joint. This is your thumb joint, okay? This is two surfaces, both convex and concave in nature. So this is bringing back last week's summary in our PowerPoint pretty hardcore. So if you need to review it, please do. But both surfaces have a convex and a concave in nature. And the convexity of one surface articulates with the concavity of another and vice versa. So if your mind is kind of like, wait, what? Think about this structure right here. Pretend like this is a saddle that's on a horse. You have your horse right here, and you have your saddle right here. You have a concavity on the horse as well as a convexity. Same way with the saddle, it's going to have a concavity and a convex. Do we see that? As you put that horse or that saddle on your horse, your saddle is going to have a curve that's forward and back, and then a curve that is going up and over the horse side to side, and vice versa with the horse. So if you can visualize that horse and saddle, that is basically what is happening within your thumb joint. And that's what causes you to have so much range of motion in your thumb compared to all of the other joints in your hand. Last but not least here, we have the triaxial, 3 axes, 3 planes. Makes sense, right? This is where we have a lot of movement. The ball and socket joint. Makes sense. Think about the ball. Like convex structure fits into the concave socket, okay? It's like a ball in a glove. Sometimes if it's a shoulder socket, that glove's going to be very shallow, versus if you have your hip socket, that's more of a deep socket. So you have the iliohumeral, that's going to be referring to your hip. Glenohumeral, that's referring to your shoulder. A lot of mobility in this structure. And last but not least here, talking about non-axial. This means that a joint in which motion occurs in one plane, but not about an axis. It's exactly what it says, right? Non-axial. And if you remember talking about gliding, we talked about that before. Well, this joint is a gliding or plane joint consisting of 2 surfaces that are slightly curved or flat, being able to move on each other. We see this in our carpals, so the bones of our wrists. And we also see this in the intervertebral facet joints. So you guys were able to remember that from your diagrams. Yeah, we're talking about those structures. They're able to glide. You want them to be able to have this smooth gliding motion because the conjoining parts of this joint have that surface area of cartilage to where it's nice and smooth as it glides back and forth. So that was, the types of synovial, the types of joints in general. Now we're going to kind of break this down into the functionality of the joint. And I want you guys to, if you need to star this, write it down. Some people, they like to put on Post-it notes and kind of have it on hand, because you will see these 3 words a lot from here on out, okay? In tests, on other PowerPoints, quizzes, okay? So get familiar with these. Synarthrotic. This is the function, remember? Synarthrotic, that means that there's no movement allowed. Example here, they put coronal sutures, okay? Ampiarthrotic, this means minimal movement allowed. Pubic symphysis, sacroiliac, and syndesmotic joints. Diarthrotic, that means a lot of movement. So think about your shoulder joint, your hip joint, your elbow, okay? So we get no movement, some movement, lots of movement, okay? Have that jotted down somewhere, because you will see that again in your tests. And like I say, the answers will come directly from this PowerPoint. So now that we've gotten all those beautiful definitions and all those classifications out of the way, let's talk about what happens within the joint, the fun stuff, okay? So the joint characteristics, what do they do? What can we see either in the clinic or in the gym or in the hospital whenever we're looking at, say, a patient or a client? Well, first, let's break something down here. So a lot of confusion floats around the terms mobility, flexibility, stability. And I see this happen day in and day out in my clinic, at the gym. People are like, oh, I need to get more mobile, or I need to, I need some, I think stability, I just have too much, or something like that. And the way that they're using it, they're not understanding what's going on. So I want to break this down for you. And if you have any questions, you're gonna let me know and make sure that you jot it down. Mobility is the degree of range of motion in a joint. So remember, it's inside the joint space. We're not talking about the muscle. We're talking about inside the joint space, how much you can move it unassisted, you move it. Versus flexibility, the ability to move a joint or a series of joints through their full range of and unrestricted range of motion. So I like to think of it this way. Maybe if you have ever heard it explained a different way, I'd love to hear that too. But in my mind, it helps to think about mobility is isolating it within one joint. We are purely working on this one joint, versus flexibility. It's encompassing a lot more. It's encompassing multiple different joint segments, getting into the flexibility of the tissues, soft tissues, instead of just targeting the joint, okay? Versus stability, this is the yin and yang of mobility, okay? Think of stability and mobility as yin and yang. We have stability as the joint ability to maintain its integrity through the usage of the bony congruency, ligamentous and cartilaginous tissue, and surrounding musculature, okay? So whereas mobile, we wanted to see how much we can do, this is seeing how we can control and maintain this structure. We also have something called shock absorption within this joint, the ability for the joint to receive and transmit forces to other forms of connective tissue. A great example of this, which I might allude to later, but I'm going to stick it in here now. With shock absorption, we've all seen somebody jump off of a curb or out of a car, or maybe onto a box jump, and it sounds like a herd of elephants instead of like a bunch of ballerinas. Yeah, we know the difference between a herd of elephants tracing through a room versus ballerinas running across the room. And 9 times out of 10, we'll see somebody jump off of a box jump, like to jump back down, or maybe they're deliberately doing a deficit jump, and it sounds like hit, and we can almost see that where all that shock and all that force went into the knees, and they weren't able to absorb and disperse that force and that load. So what we want to see is a softer land, a more dispersed low to where the joint is able to absorb that shock instead of take all that shock. It's able to disperse it versus just hammer it in. Okay, so hopefully that paints a good picture for you. Herd of elephants versus ballerinas, but if you've ever seen that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So mobility, yin and yang. Mobility deals with the free range of motion versus stability deals with the joint position. But it has to have that yin and yang conversation. It's like a teeter-totter. If you have high mobility, you're going to have limited stability. If you have high stability, you might have limited mobility. Before I ask you that last question there, think about somebody who has limited mobility, but awesome stability. Think about somebody who has maybe a very compact joint space. So like a bodybuilder or somebody who, I'm going to do the gym bro example, but the gym bro who can't really fix his hair because he can't lift his arms above his shoulders. See, you guys all visualize that with me, right? Versus the cheerleader that can basically take her leg behind her back and then flip it over her shoulder towards her face. Yeah, totally different humans. Yeah, totally different functions, totally different goals within their sport or within what they do, and they have to leverage either the yin or the yang in order to achieve their performance. But what I want to bring now into this from other lectures is, how does accessory motion affect this? And does it? How does it? Start to think about those things. I'm going to put that question in the discussion box, but I'll kind of start to cultivate this awareness and this 3D look into this concept. As if you have a lot of mobility, that probably means that you have a lot of space in the joint, yeah? Because you're able to move it a lot. Versus high stability, you're probably a little bit more compressed. You have a lot more bulk. You have a lot more maybe tightness within the space. So how or does accessory motion affect this? All right, so let's talk about things that might restrict mobility. Some stuff, it might be bony, so it's structural. There's a bony articulation that provides a limit to a movement when one joint surface fully compresses into another. Think about whenever you straighten out your elbow. Now, there's a caveat to this, but whenever you straighten out your elbow, there's the key-like structure at the end of your elbow that hooks in to your humerus. And that key-like structure should be just long enough to where whenever you extend out that arm about 180 degrees, it hits bone on bone, okay? Now, there could be a shorter key or a bigger key, because every human is different, every body is different, but we have that bony articulation that can help to limit that movement. Next up, joint capsule. So this actually limits movement by connecting one joint surface to another joint surface. Think about whenever you take, and here's where you get to imagine this with me. You take your arm, so we're looking at the glenohumeral joint, so our shoulder joint. Whenever you take your arm and abduct it, that means you're taking it out towards the side, and then you externally rotate, so that means that we take our hand back. We kind of hit this limit within the capsular space. It's almost like a soft end feel. What do I mean by that? It means that it's not like you hit bone on bone. It means it's just that you can't go any further. Same thing happens in the hip. Why? Because they're ball and socket joints and they have a joint capsule. You also have ligaments. So basically you have these nice little tie down structures, and think of them as almost struts in a car that provide limitations to movement by securing a bone to the other. But you also have to think of it like a struts in the car, because it's also providing space within the joint, okay? So yes, it is a tie down. Yes, it's holding them together, but it's also a strut that helps to keep that joint in a good open space. And something good to think about is like the ligaments in the knee. We see this all the time. It's football season. or maybe it's football season right now, you have a player who goes down and they're holding their knee, and you see that they can take their knee like just at the knee joint way out to the side. And sure enough, you test their LCL, their lateral collateral ligament, and there's nothing there to stop you. It's supposed to be there, but it's not. That ligament's supposed to restrict that mobility to take that knee lateral. Common restrictions here as well, bony pathologies, which we kind of talked about, but this is a pathology. So that means that instead of it just being a bony articulation or, that's supposed to be there, this is one of those things where, something happened. So bony pathology such as a fracture. You broke something and that maybe there's a spare bone piece that's floating around that pinches or that restricts movement. Arthritis or osteophytes, aka the joint mice that kind of break down the bone. Maybe that's what's restricting that mobility. Capsular pathologies, that means a shrinking or tightening of the musculature capsule due to an injury in the joint. Maybe you haven't been doing much, so now crossing your legs is hard. Whenever it used to, that was no problem, but you've had a desk job for a while. Maybe immobilization. Maybe you had, I see this a lot in my ladies who've had cesarean sections. So you've had a cesarean and you are now trying to get back to doing what you did before, but you were not allowed to move very much for a couple months. You're going to notice that there's some stuff that is now tightened up and might prevent some of that mobility. Ligament pathology. So this means that, hey, something happened to a ligament due to injury, inactivity, or immobilization. Again, something happened to the ligament, and so it's starting to lock down that mobility. Sorry, guys. All right. So hopefully all that's making sense. Common restrictions to mobility. Here's a few more. Musculotendinous junctions. So where the belly of the muscle comes in and meets the tendon, that is called a musculotendinous junction. This area provides limitations to movement when it's pulled to its maximal length or whenever it's compressed. So think about whenever you bend your knee, you start to feel that stretch and that tug all through the muscle and then maybe almost to the joint. That's probably right around the musculotendinous junction. But that muscle and the tendon are going to feel that stretch or that length or that compression as you take it into that range of motion. And then also where the musculotendon pathology comes into play is, guess what? You have injury, inactivity, or mobilization, okay? That'll happen as well. Think about how easy it might be to touch your toes in a forward fold just any day of the week versus after you've strained your hamstring. It's gonna be a completely different toe touch compared to before injury. Last few things here, you guys, hang with me. The other things that we need to think about is if there's mechanical joint locking, and this happens quite a lot. Especially think about a knee. If you have a knee cartilage or meniscus that is injured, maybe it's loose or flapping over, it can actually start to lock up the knee joint. Swelling, think about whenever you have an injury, how that inflammation and that swelling response can sometimes limit that mobility of the joint, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. If you know me, you know that, especially if you listen to the heat and ice debate, you know that initial swelling is a good thing. Now we need to be able to have that whole system functioning optimally and reduce that swelling, but that initial swelling is actually helping to protect you. And then loose bodies, think about if you have torn away cartilage or bone, and then that is floating around and it might wedge and lock up the joint and cause limits in mobility. Last few things here. Closed packed versus open packed or loose packed position. And this has to do with where you are in the joint angle and how that opens or closes your joint space. So closed packed, a joint position in which joint structures are under the most compressive stress, versus loose is the least amount of compressive stress. So if I've straightened out my knee, so think about your leg, maybe extend it out right now. And I tried to wiggle around your knee right now. If you straightened out your leg, I wouldn't get much, I wouldn't be able to move it very much, right? Like everything's kind of compressed in together. Your kneecap is kind of smushed into that crack between your femur and your tibia. Yeah, there's not much there. Versus if I bend your knee, say, 35, 45 degrees, then I could get some anterior translation. I could get some side to side translation of your patella. There's a lot more wiggle room because I've opened up that joint space. And sometimes that's a good thing because that's how I test for ACL, LCL, MCL, PCL tears. I have to get to where the bone is out of the way, and then I can get to the soft tissue. So these two words aren't, and these restrictions aren't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we can leverage that to our advantage. Okay. Wow, we covered a lot. Hopefully a lot of that was, maybe some of that was new for you. And I'm excited if it was. Please go re-watch this. This isn't a huge lecture. Go back through it, learn a little bit more, because I will have a nice discussion coming up over some of these concepts. So I want you guys to be able to have a good, thoughtful discussion. I'm going to hop in there as well, just to add my 2 cents or maybe cultivate some more thoughts. Maybe I can learn from you guys, your experiences. So great job today. Review this again. Maybe go deep dive and go nerdy, go nerd out on YouTube, whatever helps you kind of visualize these concepts since we're online. Please do it. Bring it back and share some of it with us with the discussion. Have a beautiful day, you guys.